I have to deal with the much bigger territory of Yugoslavia, of what was Yugoslavia, quite different in its historical and cultural tradition, ethnic composition, economic and political development. And all this diversity largely contributed to the nature and characteristics of the German and the Jewish communities in the region. It is unworthy of underlying, therefore, that one has to differentiate the nature and the characteristics of the German and Jewish communities in what is today Vojvodina, that's northern part of Serbia, in Slovenia, in Bosnia, and finally in Croatia. For example, in Croatia, and there are specificities within these regions or the states, or states now. In Croatia, it should be known that the German immigration to Slavonia, for example, was at least quite different from the immigration to Zagreb and few other bigger cities. When it comes to the Jews, there were also strong regional specificities, not to mention the mixing of the Ashkenazi newcomers with autochthonous Sephardim communities in Bosnia and in Belgrade. And I think that Eli spoke yesterday, but at least gave you some elements of that history. The organizers are asking us to consider whether this German-Jewish connection, as it is stated in the title of this conference, is a possible one. Of course it is. They suggest that it should be a very flexible notion and that we should admit it as such. And we are examining and questioning this connection. The relations in the triangle, Jews, Germans, and the utilization of the German language are complicated and stratified. Therefore, I have chosen a specific approach. My goal will be primarily to analyze the attitude of the dominating nations versus the Germans and the Jews. So how to start the story about the ties with the German culture and nation in the South Slavic lands? Perhaps even with 1596, when the dictionary of 5 most prominent European languages, Dictionarium quicque nobilissimarum Europae Nicolarum in Latin, by Faust Frančić of Šibenik, born in Šibenik, was printed in Venice, in which Croatian appeared, that 5 languages, appeared alongside with Latin, Italian, German, and Hungarian. The choice of languages in the dictionary clearly shows where Croatian cultural interests lay and indicates the future outline of Central Europe. So Italy, Croatia or South Slav lands, Hungary, Germany, or German lands in those times, of course, including Austria. You will understand why this piece of evidence is important for me in the further elaboration. In the South Slav lands, there was throughout centuries admiration and fascination by the German culture. The urge to emulate German way of life and to achieve level of relative high standard of living that majority of German population had. As a result, people were adopting customs and cultural patterns, learning, speaking and writing in German. The German culture made the biggest impact on the social and economic development, bigger than any other great culture which could contest its influence, for example, Russian, in the Orthodox parts of the region, or French, maybe in end of 19th, beginning of 20th century. Of course, this influence of German culture and language was due primarily to the fact that Habsburg monarchy integrated some South Slav lands, or these lands were in the immediate neighborhood of the monarchy. In the same time, there were also completely different facets of approach towards the German, Austrian, or the German culture. Mistrust, doubt, skepticism, sometimes even hatred. And this love and hatred game goes on for centuries and strongly influenced the attitude to the Volksdeutsche in the 19th and the Jews in the 19th and the 20th century. That dichotomy, love and hatred, is fabulously depicted by, for example, I am giving just one of many possible examples, one of the greatest Croatian and Yugoslav writers, Miroslav Krleža, born in 1893, died in 1981, whose work was deeply immersed in Central European environment, in its predominantly Austrian-German culture. Still, Krleža is full of criticism towards the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its heritage. And this dichotomy is nothing extraordinary, exceptional for South Slav lands, may I say. It has been elsewhere presented very strongly in Central Europe. Probably the Czech situation or Hungarian situation are the most similar ones. We can discuss about that. First wave of the German immigration started at the beginning of the 18th century, when they settled deserted land in Croatia and Vojvodina after the retreat of the Ottomans. Waves of capitalistic development from Europe rolled into the Austrian Empire, and in the 18th century, the Habsburg emperors tried to reconstruct the society and the state to meet the new needs. Germans who were moving into the South Slav region also brought some modernization. In the 60s of the 18th century, Ferg's books in German were printed in Croatia. In the 70s, German replaced Latin first in schools, then in administration and the judiciary. German settlers were coming from different German regions: Württemberg, Hessen, Baden, Bayern, etc. In the 19th century, but one term prevailed, even among the Germans and among the domestic population. The Germans were called by local population Schwabe. In German it's Donauschwaben. This term Schwabe in the Second World War had a pejorative meaning, and it is used by Yugoslav partisans instead of Nazis, the Nazis or the Germans. So when they were speaking about the Second World War, they were fighting Schwabe. When the immigration of the Jews began in South Slav lands at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, anti-Semitism fed on the usual themes: antagonism between Christianity and Judaism, competition of Jewish merchants, a general feeling of xenophobia against Jews as newcomers and internal migrants. In this region, there was an additional reason for mistrust towards the Jews, because the first generation of immigrants spoke only Hungarian and German, which were, in those times, of course, as I said, considered as languages of the masters and invaders. Especially in the second half of the 19th, at the beginning of the 20th century, in a very complicated political and cultural circumstances, this aroused the sensitivity and even open animosity of the members of the national movements, both the Serbs and the Croats. Anti-Semites were often attacking the Jews because they were allegedly speaking German or were using too many German words, and there was a specific verb for that: Schwabcharity. Schwabcharity. So Schwab, I can't translate it in German. Schwabcharity. Yeah. Yugoslavism or South Slavism grew on the foundation of the program that had started in the 1848-49 revolution, one of forging links between South Slavs and the monarchy. In later decades, it linked arousing Croatian, Serbian and Slovene national consciousness with feeling that those three nations belonged to the broader family of Slavs, primarily in the cultural scene, and that Yugoslavism was the base framework, even a condition for survival of a small and weak nation. Logically, every such ideology has its adversaries, if not enemies. In this case, Italians, Hungarians, Germans, in fact Austrians, for the time being. Who were those who were allegedly endangering the interests of the Yugoslav people, if not threatening their very existence? In the same time, each of these nations were developing their own national consciousness. In the 50s of the 19th century, Ante Starčević developed the idea, for example, of the independent Croatian state. He was attacking Austria, in other words, the Germans, as a sworn historic enemy of the Croats. Starčević was a very complicated person. He hated Germans so much that he decided to be buried in a small village cemetery in Šestine, near Zagreb. Now it's the part of the city, because he thought that too many German bones and skeletons are already polluting the city of Zagreb, and he didn't want to mix with them even when he was dead. Germans that immigrated and settled in the South Slav countries didn't have national political consciousness, as Karl presented in his book, sense of belonging to one nation or state until the late 19th century. The elements that unified and differed them from the Slavic neighbors were language and cultural heritage. We can recognize almost the same pattern with the same pattern of the same pattern among the Jewish population on their territory. Until the end of the 19th century, before Zionism as the ideology emerged, the Jewish communities were just isolated religious groups with no national or political awareness. The Jews were under the constant social pressure, therefore to conform with the majority. The process of the cultural assimilation and social integration of the Jews in the surrounding culture started or was going on in those times based on Haskalah of Moses Mendelssohn from the 18th century onwards. So both groups, that means the Germans and the Jews, promoted new patterns and ways of doing business and living life in general, and compared to the others, they were more productive and well off. Germans were buying land and became the biggest landlords in the area. Jews were extremely successful entrepreneurs and merchants. Comparing to their Slavic neighbors, they introduced and developed new methods and concepts in trade and business. They were dedicated to hard work and moderate life. By introducing, developing, and imposing new facets of doing business, they contributed to the disappearance of the guilds and all merchant habits. So that aroused tensions, clash, envy between the progressive newcomers and the domestic people who were losing their positions and power. And these elements, these episodes can certainly be viewed as those who were the roots of the future national tensions. Creation of Yugoslavia. In those times it was called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. In 1918, brings Germans and Jews in a completely different situation. The authorities and many of those who were supporting them were promoting an ideological picture of the past. Foreign powers, that means Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Italians, foreign powers ostensibly had once dismembered and allegedly unified Yugoslav people and had politically and culturally alienated them, one from the other. Unity would not only bring liberation to blood brothers from foreign domination, it would also implicate the removal of deposited foreign influences and a return to the unified national origin. So, everybody who was non-Slav was seen as the other. That was the philosophy. So we, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, against the others. So the Germans were degraded for high position constitutive nation and powerful policy makers to the position of the national minority. More or less the same thing happened to their compatriots in the newly constituted states such as Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania. Therefore, in the next few years, although protected by international agreements and contracts, German minority was deprived of various rights. For example, right to vote, right to participate in the agrarian reform, etc., etc. All the German schools were abolished. One of the consequences was massive emigration, first from Slovenia, then from Bosnia. But one has to take into account that comparing with the other national minorities in Yugoslavia, like Hungarians, Macedonians, Albanians, Germans were still in a much better position. they were economically still quite strong, and the agreement signed in 1931 between Yugoslavia and Germany allowed German schools to be reopened. In 1920, Kulturbund, Schwäbisch-Deutscher Kulturbund, was founded in Novi Sad as a non-political organization. This event marks the beginning of the systematic cultural and social emancipation of the German minority in Yugoslavia. And it was also a specific national revival, although belated, may I say. I'm checking with Carl. Better to check. That was the time when Jews, speaking about the Jews in the same period, the Jews enjoyed equality before the law for almost half a century, because in Serbia it was after Croatia or parts of Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, but they were enjoying equality, but the full equality, in the sense that the Jews, their religion and culture were considered equal in Croatian, Slovenian or Serbia society, in the Catholic or Orthodox or Islamic environment, was still a long way away. Resistance was often not explicit, but involved the very complicated and problematic relation between the state and the Catholic and Orthodox Church. Jews faced deeply rooted prejudice still. They were threatened by envy and business competition. Social equality was, therefore, I can conclude, never achieved in the interwar Yugoslav society, and in 1940, before the war started in 1941, open discrimination started. In the first years of Yugoslavia, the authorities applied two sets of criteria in relation to the Jews. The loyalty of the Serbian Jews, almost all of them Sephardim, many of whom had bravely fought in the Serbian army in the First World War, was never questioned. The Bosnian Sephardim, particularly those in Sarajevo, were regarded as an autochthonous and indigenous element who had, thanks to 4 centuries of life in the region, gained special rights. None of this was true for the Ashkenazim. The Serbian Jews were ours. They spoke Serbian. Ladino has mostly been forgotten, whereas the mother tongue of some foreign Jews, most of them were Ashkenazim, was German or Hungarian, especially Hungarian in Vojvodina, of course. The situation was paradoxical in many ways. The Sephardim kept their culture and lived in relative isolation from the broader community. There were very few mixed marriages. Assimilation and conversion to Christianity were rare. In Sarajevo, this was the result of urban multiculturalism. In contrast, the Ashkenazim in Croatia and Vojvodina adopted the language of the environment relatively quickly, and in a short time they underwent a cultural and religious, political and national assimilation. Despite all this, they were seen as more foreign than the Sephardim. The feeling that they were a foreign body, that they were different from the majority of a predominantly Slav or Christian society, became even stronger after 1918. With the formation of Yugoslavia, all the links that Ashkenazim had with the much larger Jewish communities in Austria, Hungary, Bohemia were suddenly broken. Instead of being a periphery that was to look to its center, they now had to find their place in a completely new situation. There was a problem of deporting Jews, and it already appeared in the first month of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The government considered deportations necessary of those Ashkenazim who still had documents issued in the other parts of what was once Austro-Hungarian Empire. Although some of them have been living in Croatia, Vojvodina or Bosnia for several decades, the Yugoslav authorities felt that they have not gained the right to acquire citizenship. Thus, deportations began, although various Yugoslav and international Jewish organizations were engaged in preventing it at the Paris Peace Conference. But why I'm saying this, why I'm giving you this, speaking about this history of deportations, because there is an important thing. There were important things going on behind the scene. Behind the scene was that Rabbi Isaac Alkalai, the Yugoslav chief rabbi, Isaac Alkalai, who was Sephardim, was informed about this, and in Belgrade, as he was in Belgrade, he went to see the Prime Minister Stojan Protic. Came to Protic and told him what it is about. Protic said, I don't know, I know nothing about this decree, I know nothing about deportations. Of course, he knew, but he pretended that he doesn't know. And then the Rebbe laid clear evidence before him. And then Protic said, listen, why are you getting so upset about these Hungarians and these Germans? No one's bothering the Serbian Jews or the Bosnian Jews. What do you care about those others? Although the Protestant German or the Protestant Englishman share their religion, or the Catholic Czech and the Catholic Hungarian share the same religion, they have nothing in common. They can be the fiercest enemies, said Protic. And then Alkalai explained to him that there was a single Jewish people. And Protic at the end accepted it. So the deportation have been stopped, although there were some attempts to renew them. But this is the proof how this perception that Sephardim are autochthonous and Ashkenazim are Germans was still vivid and obvious at the beginning of the it was in 1919, 1920. This episode happened. So we can also say that Isaac Alkalai also, he was not a Zionist, accepted some basis facts of the ideology of the Zionism, which was saying that the Jews are not only religion, but they are a unified nation. In the anti-Semitic outbursts in those times, Jews were often linked with the German culture. For example, they were criticized that allegedly they attack the Slavs wherever they can and do not condemn the Germans and the Hungarians. The author of a certain pamphlet asks himself, where is their sacrifice in blood for Yugoslavia? Of the Jews, of course. There is nowhere. The accusations were often absurd. In 1935, for example, some Zagreb newspapers attacked the Jews for attending the performances of visiting German theater troops because they watched performances in German. When the Jews drew out conclusion from these articles almost collectively and proclaimed the boycott of German performances, the same source criticized them for not attending performances of a high artistic level. Karl Bethke is posing the right question. Was there a Yugoslav German? Gabes, Yugoslavian Deutsche. And quotes a statement that really explains that the very core of the problem, namely the representative of the German Association said that also for us Germans, 1st of December, that means the date of the creation of Yugoslavia, is the day of unification. A few years ago I started to research of the history of the Albanians in Yugoslavia, posing basically the same question. Was there a possibility to create Albanian Yugoslav or Yugoslav Albanian? And I do not have the final answer, because the answer, whichever it would be, cannot be an easy one. It implies our understanding of what was Yugoslavia. Was that state an ideal state framework? Was it an artificial construct? Or was it a prison of certain people? In other words, were the Germans and the Jews and the Albanians and the other minorities really equal in the interwar Yugoslavia? And we can speak about, of course, about socialist Yugoslavia as well. The answer can be given in various ways. For example, both the Germans and the Jews in large numbers were integrating or even assimilating in the Slavic society. Assimilation of these two peoples was carried out in certain elements in a very similar, in some other elements in a different way. First of all, position of the German language in the Yugoslav society from 1918 onwards aggravated German lost gradually the position of the second language. When I say second language, I do not mean foreign language. I mean language of the intellectual elite, language of international communication, the position which now English has, as you see from my intervention as well. For example, German became a real foreign language. For example, Agramet Tagblatt, the last German newspaper in Zagreb, ceased to be published in 1922. And the Dao in Osijek was published till 1938. So it shows a certain process. In the circles of the intellectuals and bureaucratic elite, French started to replace German. The Germans in the bigger cities, particularly in Zagreb, relatively rapidly were assimilated in the Croatian and Catholic environment. For the Jews, the key factor was, of course, Christianization, if they were ready to undertake this step. There was a certain number of the Jews who were changing their surnames. The surnames were translated or were transformed to sound more Croatian or Serbian. Veljković, Gross, Grabarić, Grimbaum, Borković, Grimbaum, Crnić, Schwarz, Bijelić, Weiss, Zvijezdić, Stern, Ružinski, Rosenzweig, and so on and so on. So we are coming to the 30s. In the 30s, dramatic changes started to happen. Kulturbund was for more than a decade committed to the slogan fidelity to the state, fidelity to the people, Stadttreu und Volkstreu, which underlies the will to resolve problems in the multinational and multicultural society not by escalation of the tensions and clashes between various social, national and religious groups, but by avoiding them. Nevertheless, this have changed when the group of so-called renovators, Erneuer, started to take over the organization, and you explained it quite well for in the case of Slavonia. And it was a long process, and I'm speaking also about Vojvodina, and it only ended in 1939 when new pro-Nazi generation overtook Kulturbund by expelling old leadership. More or less the similar events, as you know, took place in Hungary. In the same period took place in Hungary and Romania. At the end of 1931, Yugoslav police, for example, revealed that in chapters of Kulturbund in Vojvodina, youngsters are swearing on the flag with Hakenkreuz that they will not marry Serbian, Hungarian or Jewish girls. 2 years later in Zagreb, during the celebration of a German holiday, according to witnesses, the speakers were instigating against the Jews according to the spirit of the Nuremberg laws. Nevertheless, Jewish organizations, even in 1938, were assessing that all the Germans in Vojvodina do not sympathize with the new politics in Kulturbund, and that they were giving examples of a friendship between the Germans and the Jews. The Donau, the journal of the German Catholic minority in Yugoslavia in 1939-1940, firmly refused glorification of racism, although we respect our origins and cherish our nationality. For us, nationality is not something that divides us from the others. We consciously try to overcome the obstacles imposed by the national differences. We aspire to create one community of all human beings of goodwill. When a few months later a village school teacher in Vojvodina said that people should not read Old Testament because you can only find Jewish names and immoral behavior, the Donau started a debate saying that teacher's statement is nothing but a version of the so-called New German worldview, Weltanschauung, with one obvious goal: to provoke bitterness and hate. One episode in the excellent memoirs of Erwin Miller, survivor of Jasenovac Ustasha camp, show how during the 30s the cooperation and harmony between two ethnic communities was damaged and finally destroyed. Miller describes how he, in 1938, when he was 14 years old, broke friendship with a friend named Fabian, who was German. And all this happened in the Slavonian town of Vinkovci. Fabian invited Erwin to his house when nobody was at home. He received his guest in the Hitlerjugend, wearing the Hitlerjugend uniform with Hakenkreuz on his sleeve, and he saluted him with Heil Hitler. After that, Fabian explained how big genius Hitler was and how he is going to solve all the world's problems, including Jews. You don't have to be afraid, said Fabian to Erwin, because we are friends, and when Hitler comes, we shall defend Jews from their enemies. Miller left his friend's house, shocked and completely confused. He ended their friendship, and he said, I tried to avoid Fabian, I even began to be scared. Although Fabian later apologized or tried to apologize and tried to preserve their friendship. The horrible turmoil of the Second World War began in Yugoslavia with the attack of the Nazis and their allies in April 1941. Persecution against the Jews started immediately, which led to the Holocaust, while the position of the German was different in various parts of the ex-Yugoslav territory. In the regions directly occupied by German forces and in the Ustasha independent state of Croatia, so-called German People's Group was constituted, the Deutsche Volksgruppe, which had various public competencies. In fact, they were made a privileged group in the society in many ways, not only in the relation to the members of the persecuted nations and religious groups. The Deutsche Volksgruppe was creating its institutions according to the totalitarian concept. They were publishing, for example, proclamations such as this one. Every German youngster or girl should join our youth organization, Deutsche Jugend. This call is in fact the order. Who doesn't join the organization will lose our protection and would not be recognized as the German. In independent state of Croatia, even the Croats and the Catholics felt marginalized and threatened by the Deutsche Volksgruppe. I'm not saying that this was the case. I'm just saying that some Croats were stating that as being truth. And I'll give you a few examples. In summer 1941, the Croats from Bosanski Shamac, now northern Bosnia on the border with Croatia, complained that in their town, members of Kulturbund took over all better Serbian or Jewish shops whose owners had to leave. In a village near the town of Virovitica occurred a very unpleasant incident between German soldiers and our distinguished people who suffered. I don't know whether suffered means that they were killed or not, nevertheless, but they were completely innocent. So in that region, concludes the report, the atmosphere became extremely difficult between the Croats and the group around Kulturbund. The leadership of Kulturbund in some places is in hands of the enemies of the Croatian people. Tensions were big, so the Führer or Poglavnik of the independent state of Croatia, Ante Pavelić, tried to calm down the situation by various means. So he named attorney Jakub Eliker for president of the county of Srijem. Srijem is now in Vojvodina, in Serbia. Then it was in the independent state of Croatia. In the public statement, Pavelić underlined that he is naming Eliker, a representative of the German community, to this high position because he is fully convinced that it will be the basis for a fruitful cooperation of the German national group in the independent state of Croatia with the Croatian people. Eliker answered that he is, as German, aware of his commitments versus the German people as well as to the Führer Adolf Hitler. At the end, he added that he is also aware of the necessity to keep a firm relation between independent state of Croatia and the Third Reich. And it was in the last sentence in his proclamation that he is in a certain manner recognizing the sovereignty of the independent state of Croatia. I'm saying that because you should understand how these tensions between the Croats, domestic people, and the German minority was arousing and intensifying as the war was coming to its end. Despite all these tensions, there is a clear evidence that, at least in Slavonia, the identities of the Croats and Germans are quite close. Some of the German people cherished double identity. They were considering themselves both Germans and Croats. And I will quote a document written by the Ustasha from 1941, written by the Ustasha official in the county of Osijek named Blažević, who analyzed the ethnic situation in the region. He divided, therefore, the population in 5 groups. First group, the Germans who speak German at home, who consider themselves being Germans, and who are member of the Volksgruppe. Second group, the Germans who speak German at home, but who were always members of the Croatian organizations, voted before the war for the Croatian parties, and now want to join the Ustaša movement. The Croats who have Croatian family names, but are inscribed in the Volksgruppe. Croats with the German family names who speak in the house only Croatian. They and their children do not speak German at all. They consider themselves Croats, so they regularly join Ustaša ranks. Croats with German family names who speak in the house only Croatian. They speak very little or non-German, but are inscribed in the Volksgruppe. Among them, there are some who want to leave Volksgruppe and want to join Ustaša movement. It seems to me that this document clearly shows the complexity of the situation and variety of the answers which were given in the present terrible times. Coming to the end. So, to conclude, during the years of the war, the position of the Deutsche Volksgruppe changed dramatically. At the beginning, they were collectively privileged. Soon they became collectively responsible and guilty for the crime which were committed by some members of the groups. And already in autumn 42, they became collective victims. Because of the anarchy and insecurity, partisan units were already attacking Volksdeutsche villages in Bosnia in summer 42. So practically all Volksdeutsche, some 20,000, left Bosnia before the end of 1942. In 43 and 44, the same process will take place in Croatia and in Vojvodina. During the war, the number of Volksdeutsche in military units was constantly increasing, but more and more due to forced recruitment. There were many who fled from the recruitment or even from the front. By the Nazi propaganda, they were called traitors of the country and they were threatened with the fiercest punishment. In August 43, partisan unit named Ernst Thälmann, sometimes it is called Free Germany, constituted solely of Volksdeutsche, has been founded in Slavonia. At the end of 1944, the flee from Yugoslavia became general. Some of them who were fleeing committed war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, but nobody has never been brought to the court because of that. That responsibility and guilt became the burden for their compatriots who stayed and had clear consciousness. So that's the tragedy, real tragedy of the situation as I understand it. And that was the beginning of the tragedy of Volksdeutsche after the war. In this sense, the Jews and the Germans once again share the same or at least similar destiny, becoming the victims of the war and post-war catastrophe. It is curious, if not cynical, that some Jews by the new communist authorities in 1945 were suspecting of being Nazi collaborators or Nazis. For example, 64 years old Richard Levenherz and his wife Dagmar, as the refugees from Coburg, from Germany, survived the war in Zagreb. During the war, they were not persecuted, probably because Dagmar was not Jewish. But after the war, the Yugoslav intelligence services were investigating whether they were Jewish and how they were not persecuted. Erwin Miller, who escaped from the Jasenovats and met partisans, and when he met partisans, intelligence services for some time suspected him being a Volksdeutsche. Erwin Miller in Slavonia could have been Volksdeutsche as well, but he was, they understood after some time that he fled Jasenovac, so it was okay. So this is the end, and I have to add something. about the German language. I think that this book on agramerski, so-called agramerski Riečnik or Wörterbuch, Agramer Wörterbuch, that means Zagreb. Agram is the German version of Zagreb, shows what it is about. It's the German language. The presence of the German culture and language was there even without the Germans or the Austrians. Yeah, here it is. And it stayed, and it is there even a long time after the war. And there is in the regions strong attachment, and there is still attachment to the German culture, even without the German people or German minority. And it shows in many ways, but specificity is the dialect which is spoken in Zagreb and in the broader region of northwestern Croatia. There is similar attachment to the German language and culture in Vojvodina, and still existing. So I will read a couple of phrases, couple of sentences in this Zagreb dialect, and I think that die Deutsche werden sicher einige Wörter verstehen, wahrscheinlich nicht die ganze Sätze. Crkel mi je auspuhige triba, auto mi ne mre iti vrikvec, pa sam na plac išla cipelcugom. Kupila sam pol kile mlevenog meseka, paradajz i putericu za šalatu, grincajk za eingemachtes, jer ga više imam rad nego einplen juhu. Natrpala sam pun ceker, cögn, špeceraja za obed i za fruštik. V birti pored placa lokalni luftinšpektori pili su gebišt. Jedan mi je čak i hofiral, a na kraju me pozdravil sa servus milostiva, bedak. Ispred grade bedinerica je klofala tepih na klofer štangi kraj vešeraja. Ušla sam u haustor i primila se za gelender, jer mi je već bilo dosta tog šalabajzanja s punim cekerom. U stanu sam najprije ušla u badecimer i oprala ruke. Zatvorila sam i oberlicht, jer je bil propuh. Presukla sam se i metnula regenmaltnu na Aufhänger. Obukla sam šlafrok jer mi je tako komotnije. Bil je strgan, pa sam ga priheftala sa zihericom. Izvadila sam veš iz vešmašine i obesila ga na štrik. Kad sam sve skuhala, počistila i zgotovila, bil je već mrak. Metnula sam si viklere, navinula vekericu i metnula je na šrajptiš. Pre glave sam navukla novi šlifer i tuhicu, ugasila svetlo i prešla spat. So, Auspuff, Getriebe, Rückwärts, Platz, Grindzeug, Eingemachtes, Einbrenn, Spezerei, Frühstück, Luftinspektor, is there a Luftinspektor in German? No, Luft plus inspector is a person who is doing nothing. It's a Zagreb Gemischt, Hofiral is Hofieren, Bedinerica in Bediner, Klopfen, Teppich, und so weiter und so weiter. Thank you very much.